Back when I was just getting into anime, a friend of mine told me to watch Fullmetal Alchemist. But not the first adaptation, he said. That one wasn't as good anyway. So he told me to make sure that I just watch Brotherhood, the second adaptation that stays closer to its source material, and to leave it at that. Unfortunately, being the fool I am, I listened to him and I watched Brotherhood first. In the beginning, I was honestly pretty confused. Sure, it wasn't terrible or anything like that, but it was far from the masterwork many had made it out to be. In fact, I considered dropping it altogether. Of course I didn't, and I'm glad that I kept going with it. After all, it does get great, but boy does it take a while to get there. And there's a simple reason for that. Brotherhood was almost certainly created under the assumption that the viewer had either already read the manga or seen the 2003 anime. In case you don't know about the 2003 anime, it's a series that was made while the manga was still ongoing, and instead of adding in a ton of filler episodes while they waited for the manga to get further along, or delaying the series for large stretches of time, the creators decided to take the story in an entirely different direction. But Brotherhood and the 2003 anime still start off in a fairly similar manner and cover similar ground. Or do they? So let's explore that question together by discussing all the common ground these series cover. Spoilers for the entirety of these stories lie ahead, of course. Without further ado, let's do this. Right from the beginning, the 2003 adaptation of Fullmetal Alchemist is brimming with its own personality. A personality that is far darker than the mangas or Brotherhood's. The manga only takes a page to show us this scene, where Ed and Al have failed at transmuting their mother. This is a smart move for a number of reasons, but the most important one to consider here is that the chapter isn't going to focus on Ed and Al's botched human transmutation. Instead, it's about someone grappling with the truth, and realizing how hard it can be to accept the truth. As that general concept is more important to the manga's overall structure and themes than human transmutation itself is, this makes a lot of sense. However, this still serves as an intriguing set of images for the reader to think about, a way to pull them into the tale. Meanwhile, the 2003 anime focuses heavily on this moment, showing us all the supplies Ed and Al have for their experiment. And because of all these supplies, it's obvious that this is exactly what it is, an experiment, and one that sounds like it should be successful, at least based on the music, with the horn playing a fairly simple and victorious melody. And then the music swells into a crescendo of strings and brass, resolving up as the boys stare at their experiment. But then, as we're told about the laws of alchemy, things start to go wrong. The music is still energetic, but it's also now brooding. The once bright experiment turns dark as the screen goes black. As we're told about equivalent exchange, we're shown a stormy night. Winry and her grandma bursting out of their home, and Mustang standing in the rain. Lightning flashes across the sky, rain falls down from above. Everything about this moment is oppressively atmospheric, and when Ed sees what he's created, a monster, the screen goes black and he screams. In 2003, the focus on this moment right at the beginning of the series is so important because this anime, more than the manga or Brotherhood, focuses on human transmutation. Brotherhood, meanwhile, doesn't open up with this scene at all, and instead begins with an anime original episode that serves as a reintroduction to the characters you all know and love. Or, well, that you hopefully know and love, because otherwise this episode doesn't have that much merit. This episode, if viewed by someone who hasn't read the manga or seen the 2003 anime, attempts to introduce us to Mustang, Bradley, Ed, Al, Hughes, Hawkeye, this anime original character, Kimberly, and many more characters. It's an overload of information for someone who isn't at all familiar with the story, and unfortunately, I'm speaking from personal experience. But if we view this as the reintroduction it was almost certainly meant to be, where every moment gets the audience excited because they're getting to see some of their favorite characters again, then this is pretty good. There's some solid fights, an entirely new soundtrack that suits this anime well, and concepts like the Ishval Civil War and the idea of human sacrifices are brought up earlier here than they are in the manga. All in all, if you're already familiar with this world, its characters, and some of the manga's major plot points, this isn't so bad. However, as far as I'm concerned, it has nothing on the way the manga introduces us to the themes of truth and ignorance through the Liore chapters, and it definitely isn't as powerful as the disturbing introduction to the 2003 anime. So let's talk about the Liore section of the story, starting with the manga. In all three versions of the story, the Liore section serves a very similar purpose. We're supposed to see the danger of a man who views himself as God, Ed's amazing abilities, the ramifications of his and Al's decision, and the harm that can come from ignoring the truth. The manga, more than either of the two shows, focuses on that last one here. The most impactful moments in these chapters are ones where Rose is forced to choose between her blind faith in Father Cornello or Ed and Al's logic and rationalization. As she wants to bring her dead boyfriend back to life, it's hard for her to accept what Ed is trying to tell her. That human transmutation can't happen, that it won't happen, and that she needs to just accept that and move on. In fact, even after learning that Cornello's words are lies, she still won't turn away from them because then what does she have left? The truth? A truth that's cruel, harsh, cold, and relentless? She's faced with a moral dilemma, a dilemma similar to the one that Ed and Al encountered long ago, though we, as readers of the manga, don't know that yet if we've only consumed the manga. In this way, Ed and Al's fears and the tragedy that so often defines their character is explored through Rose. The 2003 adaptation and Brotherhood both largely keep these ideas intact, but the situation that Rose is put in when she makes her decision of who she'll trust is very different. In both of these versions, Rose isn't smuggled into the room when Ed and Al go to confront Cornello, and she isn't hidden while he gives his very typical villain speech, going over how stupid all his believers are and how he's the best and so on. Instead, in the 2003 series, she's standing beside Cornello, and although he does some incredibly questionable things, he never reveals all his cards like he does in the manga. Because of that, she's not quite put in the same situation as the manga. She isn't choosing between her own willful ignorance and the truth anymore. Later she is, but in a more subtle way that's only present in the 2003 anime, when she sees her boyfriend's silhouette but then notices the feathers that surround his bed. Though it's never stated, the intent here is clear. She knows something's wrong, but she doesn't want to admit that. Basically, in 2003, there's more room for interpretation, but it doesn't change that much about the overall message of the importance of choosing truth over lies, even if it is a bit less direct with its characters and with the viewer about these things. On the other hand, Brotherhood does something very strange, considering that it's made with the intent of following the manga closer than the 2003 series. Rose doesn't come to know of Cornello's blatant evil until everyone else in the city knows, when Ed broadcasts Cornello's voice to everyone. The reason for this is that, in Brotherhood, she isn't smuggled into the room where they talk to Cornello. Instead, he's aware of her presence throughout the conversation and never says anything that's entirely damning. Again, he does some very questionable things, but not anything that makes it immediately obvious to Rose that he's been lying about everything. Now, this might not seem like that big of a deal. After all, she still learns that there's definitely something up with Cornello, but there's not the same personal weight behind it. When she makes the decision to follow lies that she knows are lies, it's both frustrating and sad in the manga and the 2003 adaptation. Thematically, it's also part of the point. If she doesn't know that one side of the argument is full of blatant lies, then this choice really isn't as much about the truth. It's between right and wrong. Even if that is an important choice to make, it's not the same, and doesn't tie into the story's central themes in the same manner. On top of that, this episode in Brotherhood feels so routine. It feels like the creators are just going, you've almost certainly already seen this, but we better still show it quickly for those who haven't. And that mentality is evident in many of Brotherhood's earlier episodes. One example of this can be found in this episode's shot composition. Maybe this is a personal thing, but I really don't like it when TV shows or movies mimic comic books or manga's page layouts without any particular meaning behind it. Anime and film are different mediums than comics and manga, so in my mind, this sort of composition should almost never be happening, never mind as much as it does in this episode. Sure, there's one cool moment where Ed and Al become these sorts of silhouettes and their bodies are filled with an image of the sun god, a visual way of reminding us that these two people have encroached on God's territory by attempting human transmutation. But other than that, I don't have all that much positive to say about this episode. Basically, as far as adapting the manga faithfully here goes, Brotherhood's done a pretty bad job. You know how I mentioned that the manga only spends a page dwelling on the Elric brothers' horrifying pasts in its opening chapters? Well, Brotherhood chooses to show Ed and Al's past before Liore, despite the fact that it takes a very long time for us to see nearly that much detail about Ed and Al's past in the manga. To me, it's very strange that Brotherhood does this, as the Liore incident does a great job of showing the main theme of the series. So letting us see the brothers' tragic past first seems a bit backwards to me. Putting this close to the start of the series puts a lot of emphasis on the truth and the skate, both of which are central to the plot. So in some ways, this is an intelligent decision that both highlights Ed's major character traits early on and establishes some elements of the story that are going to be integral in its end. But it also makes the Liore incident feel a bit redundant. If we've already seen Ed do this and get back on his feet, why do we need to see him telling Rose to do the same thing? Of course, the Liore incident has greater significance to the plot that goes beyond Rose, but it seems that if we see this section of the story first, we didn't need to see so much of Rose. Overall, my point is that this reordering makes her struggle seem less important. But the more important problem with this becomes evident when we consider the manga's structure in its first 5 chapters. In my opinion, the manga has the stronger structure in its early sections when compared with either of the anime. It begins in many ways with typical wish fulfillment. In the first and second chapters of the story, in which we see the Liore incident, Ed is this snobbish kid who can do whatever he wants because he's cool, smart, and powerful. He's the type of guy your average young kid would want to be pretty similar to, or that they'd at least look up to. Then in the third chapter, we see Ed's actions in the mining town. In this section of the story, we see 3 very important things: Ed's kindness, his willingness to pit himself against the government if he sees good reason to, and his ability to create and execute a plan if given the chance to sit down and think. In other words, we get to see that he's a nice, smart person who has his own ideals that he's going to put above those of the people he technically works for. Ed's kindness is shown when he helps the people who live in this town, despite the fact that they've been downright horrible to him, because they lump him in with other members of the government who've been cruel to them. Ed hates seeing them mistreated, so he creates a scheme that ends with the mining town's people owning the mining town itself. This whole section then also shows us that, for better or worse, Ed is treated differently because of his status. But it also shows that he doesn't usually let this alter his actions all that much. Ed's willingness to pit himself against the government is shown through his interactions with Yoki and the way he ultimately fools Yoki into giving him the rights to the mining town by transmuting gold. This, in and of itself, is illegal, but that's just how far Ed is willing to go to help others. However, he gets around this legality, because Ed has this deal written in a very vague way, basically saying that he got the town for free. Ed is only able to convince Yoki to do this because they both know he's done something illegal by transmuting gold. But Yoki doesn't think that Ed might change the gold back into what it used to be, which he of course does. Thus, Ed protects himself while also helping others. Nothing negative comes from this. All in all, this is just a fantastic plan and makes Ed seem like a strategic mastermind. Furthermore, we're also introduced here to just how corrupt the government can be, and how the way the government handles things facilitates abuse, which is also an incredibly important thing to establish early on in the series. The battle on the train is next. Here, Ed's ability to think on his feet and fight like a champ come to the forefront. Again, he's been built up as a wish fulfillment type of character, or at the least, as an ideal, or as someone who can't seem to do any wrong. After all, we've heard about their mistakes involving human transmutation, but we haven't seen that stuff yet. As far as what we've directly experienced goes, he's the type of guy who gets things done. Because of this, it seems as though this is going to be a Rick-rollicking good adventure. Everything's going great. Hop on the train, boys and girls, we're gonna go get the Philosopher's Stone, it's all gonna be fun, right? Right? Except that's not quite right. Because the next chapter after this is the one where, Nina might kind of... Yeah, we'll get to that later. But having these events happen specifically in this order shows that Ed isn't all we thought he was. He's not invincible. He's not able to do everything right. He makes mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes can't be fixed later. He's weaker than we originally imagined. He's just some kid who can't even save a little girl. And this is the first time we've seen him this weekend. Brotherhood, meanwhile, tosses the structure out the window by reordering things and changing things early on in such an extreme fashion. Before the Nina incident, we've already seen their botched human transmutation in detail, and we've skipped the battle on the train and the mining town. This means that Ed isn't defined by his strength here. He's defined by his weakness. This is completely contrary to the story it's attempting to adapt, and it's not even done in a particularly interesting way. In my mind, this is one of the weakest aspects of Brotherhood, and one of the most major reasons that its earlier episodes aren't anywhere near as good as the chapters they're based on, or the 2003 adaptation. So you might be wondering about the 2003 anime structure then. What does it do? Well, it changes things almost entirely, as it does in many cases, so we aren't going to talk about its structure much here, but we will come back to it later. Now that we've talked about the structure, let's go through Ed and Al's botched human transmutation, starting with the manga's version of these events. In the manga, these events are framed as Ed telling Izumi about the past. While this doesn't change anything about the failed human transmutation in and of itself, it creates a natural reason for us to go back and experience this moment in more detail. Unlike in either of the animes, we see Ed and Al's mother die, then their training with Izumi in full, and then their attempt at human transmutation. This creates a narrative through line that involves Izumi's total failure to teach the boys, and puts a lot of emphasis on how her training failed them where it mattered most. We also get the sense that, until now, Ed and Al haven't quite returned to this moment, even though they need to before they can truly move on. So, in some manner, we're experiencing this with them again, and just as they've glossed over specifics in their mind while they were on their journey, we did before as well. And just as they finally really focus on it, we do too. It helps us relate to the characters in a powerful manner. I also just like a lot about how the manga handles these events. Arakawa usually presents her story in a simple manner, sticking with squares and rectangles for the panel shapes. This is something I actually really like about her work. If there's no reason to, why break away from the ordinary? After all, this means that when she does break away from conventions, it stands out all the more. Like in this scene with the truth. I love how the shapes of the panels get stranger and more dynamic as the events unfold, as Ed realizes just how grave his mistake was. I love how the backgrounds get more chaotic and how the images get darker. Arakawa is truly a master of her craft and, at least in terms of panel layouts and shading, knows that subtlety goes a long way. Now, Brotherhood's adaptation of these moments is a bit mixed. The first problem is that, because of how things have been reordered, this is no longer framed as Ed telling Izumi what's happened to them, and by extension, we don't see their training yet. Instead, we skim over their training and we aren't shown much about Ed and Al's resolve. The second problem comes from aspects of the adaptation that are more based on execution than anything else. This section where Ed and Al attempt to transmute their mother fails to adapt the tone of the manga, as it takes all the creepiness of the scene and amplifies it too much. The house is bathed in garish red light, Ed and Al's eyes aren't shown for a large chunk of this scene, the camera angle here is wonky. All of these things telegraph to the audience how wrong this moment is going to go. However, in the manga, Ed and Al go into this with a childish lightheartedness that makes this moment all the more heartbreaking, and Arakawa's simple panel construction remains constant until the transmutation goes wrong. Essentially, because of the subtlety of the manga, the bad moments hit all the harder. None of this is to say that Brotherhood does a bad job overall. On the contrary, its use of music is strong and many of the changes make a lot of sense. For example, while this scene where Ed encounters the truth contains many shots that are directly taken from the manga, certain changes are made to properly move the scene over into animation, while still maintaining the ideas that were present in the manga. Here, movement replaces changing panel shapes and changes in shading in order to still build to the moment Ed enters the gate. I have another video where I go deeper into why I think Brotherhood adapted this scene well, so you can check that out if you care to. I'll link to it in the description below. Basically, all of this is to say that, for the most part, Brotherhood does a good job of adapting Ed and Al's attempt to bring their mother back to life. Despite the fact that I have some mixed feelings about how the actual transmutation itself was handled. However, 2003 has a similar flashback in its third episode, and I prefer it to both the manga's and Brotherhood's version of these events. To begin, it expands on Ed and Al's relationship with Winry, as the brothers try to make her a gift using alchemy, but Winry is afraid of it and ends up crying. It's a great way of showing how the general public and non-alchemists may feel about how powerful alchemy is, and about the dangers that may come with it. But more importantly, it makes it clear that Ed and Al's simple and pleasant rural life is going to be disrupted by alchemy in ways that they cannot begin to even imagine. Then there are all these added moments between Ed, Al, and their mother, which takes her from being a figure who hardly appears in this section of the story to being a fairly fleshed out character. We see so much more of her loneliness and of Ed and Al's care for her here, in the moments where she falls silent and makes the strange face that Ed talks about. The extra emphasis on her feelings also naturally results in more focus being placed on Ed and Al's feelings about their father. It really feels like we're learning all about their childhood, instead of just about their mother's death and the aftermath of that specifically. We see Winry crying after learning about her parents' death, more of Ed and Al's friendship with her, more of Ed's tendency to think he can do anything, more of Ed and Al's worry that they could ever lose their mother, and more of their mother's suffering. Then there's the extra emphasis on Ed's active personality, on how the first thing he does when confronting death is to try and fix things, whether that be by bringing the person back to life or by sending letters to their father to get him to come back. And that's just the plot. I also like the tone of 2003's early episodes far more. The art style is a bit less polished, but there's a certain seriousness that comes with that suits these very dark moments well. Brotherhood's art style, meanwhile, works better for the shonen adventure the series is going to become, but that's not what the series is in these moments. Here it's a character piece about two young boys who lose their mother, the loss they feel, the foolish mistake they make, and the bond they share. The bond they share. That's something that's so important in 2003. Oddly enough, 2003 is more about Brotherhood than Brotherhood is, and that's part of why putting this episode early on makes sense here. One of the most major ideas in this series is that Ed and Al just want to be close together again, both in body and mind. So in the end, I think including this flashback here is intelligent. At this point, 2003 starts to have episodes that have no counterpart in Brotherhood or the manga. The first of these episodes is A Forger's Love. In the manga, this is where Ed and Al went to the mining town, but that section was moved later into 2003, as it serves a different purpose in this series. Instead, this episode attempts to cover some of the same ideas that Ed's exploits in the mining town did, both in terms of world building and themes. Unfortunately, however, it's not nearly as strong as that chapter, and stands out as one of the only episodes in 2003 that I consider to be flat out bad. It starts with Al stopping a purse snatcher using an alchemy circle that's just kinda lying around. Yeah, I guess they just leave those lying there, but whatever. Here it's made clear that alchemists aren't exactly common in this world and that they're often revered by regular folks. In some part, this probably feeds Ed's bloated ego, so showing it now makes a lot of sense. The next major thing we learn about in this episode is that the dead are rumored to be coming back to life in some village, which is a strong concept for a side story, considering that we only just experienced Ed and Al's botched human transmutation. The brothers choose to go and speak with an alchemist in the town that their father used to know, and from this point on, the episode basically becomes about how crazy this guy is. See, he wants to bring his lover back to life, and this means that he's using some strange form of human transmutation that combines mannequins that look like the person used to, and younger women or girls in an attempt to get her back. Now, this is a pretty cool idea, but it covers something that's going to be covered later. After all, we're going to see an insane alchemist using human transmutation for nefarious purposes, with Nina and Sho Tucker, and that part of the story isn't far away. Besides, that section is way more powerful and it has long-lasting implications for the rest of the series. This, on the other hand, is an isolated incident that is rarely, if ever, referenced later on, despite the fact that some things happened here that would likely be traumatic for Ed and Al. Plus, we've already seen how harmful alchemy can be through Ed and Al's failed human transmutation. I mean, our protagonist lost an arm and a leg and his brother lost his entire body to it, so I don't think we need to be reminded of that at this point. The message is pretty clear. Yet that seems to be a big reason why this episode was included, as Al even says to Ed at the end of the episode, "Alchemy can be used for bad purposes too, huh?" And at the beginning of the episode, Al mentions that he's glad that they could use alchemy to help that lady who got her purse snatched, so it's obvious that the episode is attempting to explore the different facets of alchemy. We're essentially being told that alchemy is just a tool and that it can be used for good or bad purposes. The problem here is that the show is treating this like something we don't realize, but we definitely know that already. Honestly, the way the show presents these ideas is a bit silly and feels almost condescending. It's one of the few moments with 2003 that I feel like I'm watching something that was somewhat made with children in mind. All in all, 2003 would be better with this episode removed entirely. As it stands now, it only serves to explore ideas that are going to be explored later in a more interesting manner anyway, and to break up the flow of the story. While Brotherhood skips chapter 4 of the manga entirely, 2003 adapts it in its 5th episode. In both the manga and 2003, this section serves to show Ed's ability to think on his feet and how he can fight competently with little to no planning. From this point on, in 2003, many of the events are going to be similar to what happens in the manga, but take place at different points in the story, resulting in Ed being younger and, in this episode, not even being a state alchemist yet. This fact, though it might not seem important on the surface, changes a lot about Mustang's character and the meaning of these events. After all, here Ed needs to prove himself so that he can become a state alchemist despite the age limit that has been added to the story in the 2003 anime. In the manga, Mustang doesn't plan to have Ed and Al on the train for this attack, and definitely doesn't get them to go on the train because he's suspicious an attack may happen. It's just dumb luck, which is totally fine. However, in 2003, Mustang specifically tells Ed to get on the train because he's already received a threat on the general's life, and realizes that this could turn out badly. Of course, he doesn't explain all this to Ed, he just yells at him to get on the train now. So he just put two kids in a life-threatening scenario so that they can maybe become state alchemists, and so that he may end up looking better and thus be able to become a more powerful figure in the government. Now, I'm not saying that I don't like this decision. This actually places a lot of emphasis on how cruel the world can be, and on just how hard Ed and Al are going to need to fight to even really begin their journey to get their bodies back. And it's also fine to crank up that ruthless part of Mustang's personality to 11. It's simply something that I felt was worth pointing out. In 2003, there are also a number of things added. One of the largest additions is this little girl, who Ed and Al interact with before the terrorists take over the train. Adding this in is a really smart move. Since Ed isn't already a state alchemist here, he doesn't have the same obligation to stop these terrorists and protect people involved with the government. However, he is still likely to want to protect common people, and this little girl exemplifies those people. It's almost always better to have an individual, at least in part, represent a group in a narrative, as that makes it easier for the audience to relate to the characters on both a small and large scale. In other words, this little girl's inclusion gives the audience something to latch onto, and a reason to care more about Ed saving these people, even if her role is incredibly minor. On top of this, their interaction with this little girl reveals the shy side of Al, the side that's afraid of being judged for his new body, as she comments on how strange she thinks Al looks. Ed, of course, goes to stick up for his brother after this, but quickly gets shy when he sees this train car full of strangers, and he just sits back down. Little character moments like this are abundant in 2003, and remind us of more minor aspects of Ed's character, and they enhance his personality and character growth overall. After all, it makes sense that he'd be a bit shy. He's from out in the country and likely hasn't been around this many people very often. This Ed isn't the same confident Ed we saw during the Liore episodes, and showing him acting this way creates a fantastic level of depth that simply isn't present in the manga or Brotherhood at this point in the story. Another addition to this sense that we're watching Ed grow up is the fact that we see him still fighting with a transmutation circle, because he still hasn't figured out that he can transmute without one. In the manga, he just kind of knows how to do that after he sees the truth. But it takes him time to understand this in the 2003 anime, and he only discovers this in a moment of intense stress later on. Having him not know things like this, letting the audience watch him learn, is an example of how his character is made more childish at this point in the series, and that gives him more room to change. Yet another change is that Hughes is introduced here. This is great because we get to witness Hughes out in the field, doing the physical aspects of his job, being intelligent, brave, and competent. It also gives us the sense that Ed can't handle this yet on his own, that he needs someone else here to help him. After all, if Hughes weren't involved, Ed would have died here. It gives Ed and Hughes a great dynamic right off the bat, a father-son deal that is going to be emphasized even more as the series moves forward. The only change I'm not fond of with this episode is the fact that Bald the terrorist explains his motivations to Ed. First of all, it's just weird that this crazy guy is telling Ed about all the inner workings of his mind. I mean, I get that he looked at Ed and kind of saw some similarity between them, so he opened up, but this feels very ham-fisted. Second, the whole idea that this guy got surgery done to have his arm replaced with guns because he wants to be stronger is a bit too silly. More importantly though, giving him this very personal reason for fighting takes away from his space in the show as a terrorist and an extremist, and this episode sets up the idea that something happened that caused these sorts of terrorists to exist. Of course, that something is the Ishval War. In other words, giving this terrorist a personal motivation takes away from his place in the show as a deluded terrorist who's presumably upset because his home was ravaged by the army. Still, in 2003, this is a strong episode for all the reasons I've outlined, and in the manga, it's great in that it works perfectly as far as the manga structure is concerned. In the manga and Brotherhood, the State Alchemist exam is over incredibly fast. Ed goes to prove his abilities to Bradley, and bam, he's a State Alchemist. It's effective in that this moment doesn't carry much weight in the manga. After all, we've already seen so much of Ed's abilities, so going back and showing him prove himself at length could feel a bit redundant. Meanwhile, in Brotherhood, some added emphasis may have been useful since the exam takes place so early in the series, and since it's going to skip some of Ed's more impressive feats that involve alchemy, the more we can see of his abilities here, the better. On the other hand, the State Alchemist exam receives far more emphasis and time in 2003. Here, only a chosen few will make it through, and people are pretty much put in direct competition with one another. We see Ed and Al training and trying to learn more at length as they prepare for the exam, and yeah, Al's training too because, unlike in the manga and Brotherhood, he's planning to take it alongside Ed. I really like this change, as it allows for more of an even focus on Ed and Al, which results in Al feeling more important and like he has more agency at this point in the story. It also allows for this moment, where Al needs to give up on taking the exam because if he moves forward, it's more likely that someone could discover that he and Ed attempted human transmutation. Having Al give up on this thing that he's worked so hard for reminds us of how much he cares for his brother and of how much he trusts him to succeed. Because of this, their bond is stronger in 2003. Other parts of this episode also strengthen their bond. Namely, when Ed and Al are sitting in their room and Al starts talking about how he can't remember how other people feel physically. This is a reminder to both the audience and Ed that it isn't easy for Al to deal with this situation, and that he's slowly losing a part of himself that makes him feel human. As far as Ed's actual test goes, first there's the written portion of the exam, where we see Ed writing in a room full of other people. This really brings home just how competitive this process is and how focused and diligent Ed needed to be to pass. Second, there's the interview where Ed needs to sit on this golden chair. Here we see that Ed clearly has the maturity and life experience to make his way through this rigorous process. Third is the physical portion of the exam, where people are trying to prove how good they are at alchemy by transmuting. In this part, it becomes obvious just how skilled Ed is with alchemy. Where other older alchemists grow tired after performing alchemy, Ed uses his with ease. He is truly on another level. My only complaint with how 2003 adapts this section is a small one, but it is important to bring up. Due to how much has been added to this part of the story, the show's pacing gets much slower. While slow pacing isn't necessarily a bad thing, I think that this could have been more interesting if we didn't already know that Ed passes. After all, since we've already seen him later on in his life, it's clear that he's already passed, and thus, some of the tension of these moments just doesn't land the way it could have. Of course, this negative does not mean that this is a bad section of the story. All those positive aspects I discussed are more than enough to make these episodes really good.